Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Virreta, and I'm the Research Coordinator for 21 CSLA. I'd like to welcome you to today's research practice webinar entitled Bugs, Bots, and Algorithmic Bias, examining the power and peril of AI in education. Today's webinar is hosted by 21 CSLA. We are dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders at the teacher, site, and district levels to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. The commitment that guides our work is that Leaders for Equity transform education by improving access, opportunity, and inclusion for both students and adults. Our focus is particularly on those who are systemically marginalized and historically underserved, ensuring that everyone in our educational community has the opportunity to thrive. 21 CSLA is a project of the California Department of Education, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and the State Board of Education. Before beginning today's webinar, we would also like to acknowledge the land that we occupy. In our active dismantling of the oppressive and erasure effects of colonial structures, we would like to acknowledge that today's webinar takes place on the land which the University of California, Berkeley occupies, the territory of the Wichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. We recognize and honor the continuous presence and living history of Indigenous peoples. I would now like to introduce you to today's webinar host, Dr. Jabari Mahiri. Jabari Mahiri is a professor in the Berkeley School of Education and the Brinton Family Chair in Urban Education. He is faculty director of BSc Leadership Programs and chair of the Leadership Board for 21 CSLA.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone to our 21 CSLA Research Practice webinar. Today's webinar invites us to take a critical look at new and evolving technologies that are rapidly shaping the educational landscape. This conversation emerged from a powerful and thought-provoking session during the Bay Area Regional Academy Winter Summit earlier this year. The energy and urgency of that dialogue made it clear that we needed to create a space to explore these ideas further, and that's exactly what today's webinar is about. As we listen, we invite you to reflect on our central framing question. What are actionable ways educational leaders can critically analyze and use AI in their context to support historically marginalized students? This is a pre-recorded session designed to give you access to the discussion at your convenience, while also allowing time for deeper reflection. Let's dive in. To get started, I want to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Tiera Tanksley. Dr. Tanksley is a faculty fellow in Critical Race Technology Studies at UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Her scholarship, which theorizes a critical race technology theory in education, extends conventional educational research to include social, technical, and techno-structural analyses of artificial intelligence technologies. Specifically, her research examines anti-Blackness as the default setting of AI and examines the social, emotional, and mental health and educational consequences of algorithmic racism in the lives and schooling experiences of Black youth. Her work simultaneously recognizes Black youth as digital activists and civic agitators and examines the complex ways they subvert, resist, and rewrite racially biased technologies to produce more just and joyous digital experiences for communities of color across the diaspora. We are honored to have her leading today's conversation. You will hear several voices in our community today, including 21 CSLA Director Rebecca Cheung, who facilitates the Q&A portion to help us explore key questions and implications for our work as equity-conscious leaders.
So my talk today is called Bugs, Bots, and Algorithmic Bias, Examining the Power and Peril of AI in Education. I want to start by just giving a little bit of insight into my experience and my background. I always share this picture of Dr. Safiya Noble because usually when I give a talk, one of the first questions I get is, like, have you looked at Safiya Noble's work? Like, you could learn a lot from her. And so I like to tell people, just to get it out in the open, that I actually was Dr. Noble's first graduate student. And so that is why a lot of the work that you will see today sounds a lot like her. Like, she really built me into the scholar that I am. So I always want to like acknowledge her and thank her for just like her ongoing support of this scholarship and just pushing me to like follow my dreams. So I actually got my PhD at UCLA's School of Education Information Studies. My co-chair, besides who worked alongside Dr. Safia Noble, was Dr. Tyrone Howard. So you will see a lot of his influence in my work today because I focus on urban education. In 2023, I was a part of the inaugural cohort for the Technology in the Public Interest for the MacArthur Fellows. And my background is in K-12 education. So despite having a lot of responsibilities in higher education, I'm actually a high school educator. I started off as an elementary school educator, but today I will show you some of my work in the high school space. So I have always been really focused on learning and pedagogy. And so I hope that some of that comes out today in this talk. So, AI kind of exploded into the field, into our conversation, I would say, in November 2022 with the onset of ChatGPT. And I like to remind folks that although generative AI kind of arose in 2022, AI has been in our classrooms for some time, right? So here's a landscape of some of the technologies that are currently in our K-12 spaces, right? So we have learning technologies. These are things maybe like Khan Academy, right? Where the goal of the technology is to increase learning. These are like math apps, things like this can also be courseware, right? We have school safety technologies. These are things like content moderation systems, or even Ring cameras, right, that are on the outside of our schools. And the purpose of these technologies is to monitor student engagement, but also protect against potential threats to campus safety. We know there's Gen AI and chatbots, right? There's so many of them now. We have character AI, we have school AI, we have Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, right? In addition to those chatbots, we have predictive analytics. These are like the early warning systems that use AI to determine which of our students are at risk of either being dropouts or struggling in class, right? And then we have classroom management systems, things like Classroom Dojo, I think is a really popular example. And there's also some features within courseware like Canvas, where we can actually monitor how students engage with coursework, whether that's if they turn things in on time, how long they spent on certain projects. I think there's also like methods to like grab students' Zoom screens and things like that to like make sure they're on the right page. So these are just some of the tools that are in our classrooms, right? There are many other types. At the same time that there's been this like platformization of education, right? The Googleization of education. This is actually facilitated by some common beliefs about technology. And I would like to really position them as myths about technology. So here's 4 of them. That technology is inherently neutral and its results are objective, trustworthy, and valid. Because technology is neutral, it can be trusted to make unbiased decisions better than humans can, and also better than educators can, right? We hear this all the time, that educators are biased, right? And they're subjective, and that actually technology can come in and be like the educator of the future. We also hear that AI is the silver bullet to remediating inequity in general, but also educational inequity in particular, right? And we've been hearing this from Sam Altman, from Sal Khan, that really it's not about historically situated, right, systemic issues. It's actually just we need to be more efficient and effective, right? And that's why AI is going to solve and revolutionize education. And finally, that racist outcomes in AI are either harmless bugs or glitches, but they're also either unavoidable or unforeseeable, right? We actually have no idea because of black box logics how racist outputs come to be. But even if they do show up, it was an accident, right? We couldn't do anything to stop it. This is why we see endless, right, headlines about the revolutionary power of AI for education, right? These are just some of the headlines that come up. AI can transform education for the better. AI is revolutionizing the world of education, and AI is changing the way students learn, right? And so I tend to wonder what type of revolutionary future big tech has in store for our young people. At the same time, there's this call for critical AI literacies, right? Um, there's a number of reasons why young people need to develop AI literacies. I pulled three of some of the most prominent claims, right? I think one of the most salient ones, as soon as ChatGPT hit the scene, was this idea of preparing students to be ethical users of AI, right? There was rampant concerns about cheating, plagiarism, right? And so the need for AI literacy was really about teaching students how to be ethical users of AI. There were also concerns about students being uncritical users of AI, right? And this is the idea that students could actually misunderstand outputs by AI as being fact, right? Not really understanding that AI can hallucinate, as big tech says. And so, really preparing them to be able to critically navigate mis and disinformation. Finally, there's conversations about our young people being ineffective or inefficient users of AI. And so this is really about, there's so many AI tools out there. We need to prepare our young people to know which platforms to use for which types of tasks, right? We need to prepare them to be strong prompt engineers, right? Knowing how to actually engage with AI to get the answers that they want, things like that. Now, that's the landscape of AI. And a lot of it, honestly, is positioned as ahistoric, right? We kind of are exposed to AI as this brand new thing. And what I would like to do in this next section is do a little bit of like a personal historical situating of my own work and my ways of understanding AI. I think it's really important to center our experiential knowledge, our familial knowledge, and our community knowledge. And so that's what I want to model in these next couple of slides. So in this image, it's actually of all of the important women, or I should say not all, because my mom isn't in this particular picture, but some of the important women in my life. I am the little baby in yellow in the center. The two other little girls are my cousins, Tori and Kiki. The woman in the yellow is actually my grandmother, Gloria, and the woman whose lap that I'm sitting on is my Aunt Wanda. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of how I got here. So my grandmother was born in Sardis, Georgia, which is the rural South outside of Augusta, Georgia, right? And so those of you who are familiar, it's like Augusta is already kind of rural, and then outside of that, right, is Sardis. And she grew up on a plantation, right? The same plantation that her grandparents were enslaved on. And she and her brothers and sisters were sharecroppers. And in order to secure a better future for herself and her kids, my grandmother moved up north to New York, where one of her first jobs was to work on a factory line for Bausch and Lomb. And Bausch and Lomb, as many of you know, is an eyeglass company. And during this time, what my grandmother did on the line for Bausch and Lomb was actually help make eyeglasses. And at the time, there was these huge machines that would actually come down and cut the glass, but they required human operators to actually position the glass in the right way. Now, these machines were timed, and so it was really important to be able to put your hand in this small hole, put the glass in the right position, and remove your hand before the apparatus came down to chop the glass. Now, as you can imagine, this was a really dangerous process, and many of the folks on the factory line regularly lost limbs, and some even died, right? And as you know, during this time, most, if not all, of the factory line workers were navigating socially engineered poverty, and they were also predominantly Black. So my grandmother witnessed all of these atrocities, these tech-mediated atrocities, and the imminent threat they had to Black life. And so what she did was she went to her boss, a white man, and she explained that she was terrified of losing her life for this, eyeglass operation. And he essentially told her that her life was worthless and that if she didn't want to help with these life-saving technologies, right, if she didn't want to be a part of the future, that she could get out. And so my grandmother, being the fiery woman that she is, she quit, and then she ended up finding a different job. Years later, she gave birth to my Aunt Wanda. And my Aunt Wanda unfortunately passed away in 2021. But during her short time here on this earth, she actually navigated many, many systemic and institutional harms. My aunt was, unfortunately, she navigated sex work and trafficking. She struggled with drug addiction. She was entangled with the carceral system. And there was an instance when I was very young where her abuser ended up blinding her in one of her eyes, right? And so I remember very clearly going to the hospital and seeing her. And at this hospital appointment, we learned that her cornea was actually detached and that there was a life-saving surgery that she could be eligible for, right? They had invented a laser that could do this repair. Now, unfortunately, because she was a sex worker, because she didn't have insurance, and because her abuser called the police on her, she was actually going to jail, right? And she was thus ineligible for this life-saving technology. The same technology that was a lineage of those eyeglass technologies, right? And so these types of moments made it very concrete to me whose life was going to be saved by these technologies and whose life was expected to be sacrificed for these technologies. I also paid attention to the types of relationships, the quiet, invisible relationships that we as a Black community were supposed to have to technology, right? And you can look at the types of technologies that exist in low-income Black and Brown communities, right? The excessive power lines, the schools that have these weapons detection systems or surveillance systems. Black and Brown communities are the home of most, if not all, of the junkyards and the electronic waste, electronic graveyards. This image on the corner, the left bottom corner, is an image of Inglewood, California. And in the background, you can see the oil rigs extracting oil from our communities, right? Being on the wrong side of the tracks. I always show a picture of these transformers. I don't see them as much anymore, but I shared them because I'm like, I feel like everybody back in the 90s hung out on these. I don't know why, but I like to just shout out my childhood. But it's very clear, right, that the anticipated relationship between our communities and technology is one of coercion, control, extraction, and containment. That actually, while they can strip power from our communities to empower other communities, that we are actually boxed in by these tools. My father, when I was growing up, was a self-taught computer scientist. So he actually hacked his way into STEM during a time where, you know, Black folks were not necessarily being employed in computer science positions. So he actually started off as a janitor, worked his way up to a mailroom employee, and eventually, you know, through time, teaching himself how to code in self-help books and things like that, actually eventually became a programmer. And so during this time, he actually taught me what bugs are, right? And so many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this term, but bugs are small, seemingly mundane errors in an otherwise effective or efficient codified system. Bugs, though tiny, often have profound and destabilizing results. And we know exactly what happens when bugs occur, right? So like, I think it was like a couple weeks ago, Outlook had a bug and the entire system was down for like 6 hours. So it's really important to recognize that these kind of small errors can have these devastating results. And so this is where the idea of debugging comes from. And I know many of you probably are computer science educators or computer scientists yourself, but this idea of searching for the bugs in the code, that in order to fix a system, we actually need to figure out where the error codes are. So I would like to do that right now, thinking about the types of technologies that are in education, and we're going to debug them. We're going to look for the bugs in the code. Starting with our learning technologies, we know that chatbots are, which are now positioned as, you know, our primary source of academic support, right? That chatbots actually spew misleading, historically inaccurate, and harmful information about Black communities and other communities. One example being Harriet Tubman AI, right, who is supposed to embody Harriet Tubman and teach her life story and Black history, but was actually quoting Kanye West and saying inherently anti-Semitic things, anti-Black things, saying that reparations were reverse racism, all kinds of things, right? I think last week we had an announcement that School AI actually had an Anne Frank chatbot who was saying horrifically anti-Semitic things there, right? There's all kinds of chatbots. Actually, a study showed that when chatbots take on the identities of historical figures who are Black, they actually spew toxicity and anti-Blackness at higher rates, right? We also know, I'm just going to throw this in here, that chatbots are terrible at math, but we increasingly use them to support young learners who struggle with math, which is, I believe, compounding this problem. We have automated grading systems that grade Black students and speakers of African American vernacular English significantly lower than other students of other demographics and more harshly than human graders. I think it's important to recognize that these grading systems are not only used prevalently in schools, but they are also the prominent way that college entrance exams are graded, right? And so if these systems are biased towards Black English speakers, right, then they are going to create artificially deflated grades, creating what I have been calling synthetic gaps in educational achievement and opportunity. There's also anti-cheating software, which became very popular during remote learning and COVID-19. And on the website of Proctorio, one of the prominent platforms that is used, they actually have a statement that said that their technology, their facial detection systems, are able to differentiate between humans and lifeless objects. And yet, what we ended up finding out was that these systems were incapable of identifying Black faces as human, right? They continually read Black students as lifeless objects. This resulted in locked exams, failed tests, and also disciplinary action, right? When students are positioned inherently as cheating. In addition to having this anti-Blackness algorithmically encoded into its systems, there's some other technologies that are similarly biased, right? Along ability, class. And so some examples are eye tracking. A lot of these systems determine whether or not you're cheating if you are looking too frequently, right? Or looking in suspicious ways, maybe off screen. They do room scans to make sure that you are in the room by yourself. And this obviously is an issue if you have young people who don't have their own room, or there's multiple people in the house. There's ID verification, which can be an issue if you are undocumented and or if your gender representation doesn't match what's printed on your license. And then they also use machine learning analytics in real time to create a bell curve, right? And so this essentially sets an average for how fast a test is being taken. And so if you are performing faster than your peers, you're flagged as cheating. And if you are performing slower than your peers, you're flagged as cheating, right? And so you can see how this is I would say exacerbating inequities. Our schools are also using predictive analytic systems to identify future behavior dropouts. Future behavior problems and future dropouts. And we found that Black youth are actually falsely identified at exceedingly high rates by these systems, right? The study on the left actually found that Black students who are identified at the beginning of the year as being future problems endured this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where teachers surveilled them more. They interpreted their behaviors, innocent, innocuous behaviors, right, as inherently problematic because they were already coded as future problems, right? So they're treated thusly. We have school safety technologies in our schools, in and around our schools, right? So I pulled an example of one that's around the school and one that's in the school. So California actually uses predictive policing. LA in particular uses predictive policing. And I want to highlight that LAUSD, which is the district that my work, the students I work with are in LAUSD. They have one of the largest private police forces in the country and in our state, right? 300 police are dedicated to just LAUSD. And then in addition to that police, we have LAPD circulating the schools. These police force use Predpol, which is software that uses machine learning to determine future criminals, right? And so there was an actual audit of this AI-induced or this AI-created gang database. And the audit found that in this list that generated future and self-identified, right, likely criminals, 87% of the names on the list were Black and brown. And a large portion of those on this list were babies under the age of 1 year old that were described by the AI system as self-described gang members, right? So you can see how carceral contact is exacerbated by AI. Schools are also using biometric detection systems like facial recognition or fingerprinting, et cetera, to engage in attendance, right? To check for attendance and to determine if students are paying attention in class. So they actually have cameras that are scanning for evidence of being off task. An audit of this system in New York actually found that the system misidentified Black boys at a rate 4 times higher than white boys. And for Black girls, it was 16 times higher, right? We also have content moderation systems, again, a school safety technology meant to protect students from harmful content or determine threats to campus safety. And researchers have found that there are biases around language, right? AAVE being one of the highest, having some of the highest algorithmic flags, right? And so Black students, when they type in Black English, are flagged as being inappropriate or dangerous, right? Similarly, searches for Black history or discussions of queer identity are also blocked and flagged. And what many people don't know is that these systems are directly connected to law enforcement. And so if you have an algorithmic flag that says that you are engaging in dangerous content, whether or not they know that that dangerous content is simply typing in African American vernacular English, the police are called, right? These technologies are taken home, right? These are the technologies that we use to increase student access. So students have school-owned devices that they take home. And so if these flags happen outside of school hours, those police are called to students' homes. And we know that Black youth are actually 6 times more likely to die at the hands of police simply when placed in front of them. So we can see how these algorithmic flags pose a direct threat to their wellness and safety. We have LLMs and Gen AI chatbots that are increasingly in our schools to help with academic learning, right? But I just want to emphasize this recent study from March of 2024 that found that the latest model of ChatGPT, which was considered the safest model, GPT-4, actually has massive harms for African Americans, right? So they found that the explicit racism that we were seeing like in 2022, 2023 has actually gone down, right? So chatbots are like less likely to use a slur, and they might be less likely to call out, like eugenics-backed science. But the implicit racism has skyrocketed. So they found that ChatGPT, which is undergirding all of our AI systems currently, right, actually recommend Black people for lower paying jobs, remedial courses, but also the death penalty, right? And this was one of the most startling findings because these AI systems that are doing auto sentencing are also the systems that are doing the predictive analytics in our schools, right? So you can see the carceral connection. If you are kicked out of school because of these algorithmic misfires that place you in front of police, right? You are similarly exposed to a same system that will auto sentence you to a harsher sentence and or potentially the death penalty. And finally, we have big tech telling us that, regardless of these outputs, which are just accidents and they're unavoidable and we have no idea how they got there, that really the fail-safe is the human in the loop, right? Unfortunately, there are biases within our humans who are in the loop, right? So multiple studies actually that came out from the Center for Democracy and Technology and Pew Research Center have found that Black students are more likely to be suspected of cheating, and they're surveilled more often. And even when the school policies support AI use, that actually Black youth are still punished for using AI, whether or not they are, or whether or not they're using it in the way that the school asked them to, right? So we have a lot of harms that are out there. Importantly, the effects of these technologies are school-wide, right? So a study by Johnson and Cole found that schools with these high tech surveillance infrastructures, right, that use AI in all of the ways that I was just naming, place more students on the discipline track, that students actually have significantly high levels of socio-emotional consequences like chronic stress and worry and test-taking anxiety and feelings of disbelonging, which we know lead to attrition. But they also have lower math scores. And the study was important because those probably make sense when you're thinking about the students who are punished. But the study revealed that these same consequences are experienced by all of the students in the school, right? So these threats are pervasive. So I have argued that the proliferation of digital and artificially intelligent technologies into education has actually made schools less safe for Black youth by exacerbating the school to prison pipeline via what Dr. Ruha Benjamin calls the new Jim Code. I also think that these current articulations of critical AI literacies that position the students as the unethical users of AI, like really need to reconsider the fact that institutions of power, right, big tech in particular, are the real unethical users that we need to be worried about. So when we're thinking about preparing our young people to have critical, effective, and efficient relationships to AI, we really need to ask ethical to whom, critical of what, and efficient to what ends, right? Because I just showed examples of how these technologies are actually really efficient at harming our most vulnerable students, right? And corralling and containing them into the carceral system. And so the landscape is a lot, right? It can feel overwhelming, but I'm reassured by the fact that history actually has a lot of examples of resistance for us, right? Audre Lorde reminds us that there are no new ideas under the sun coming to save us. That can be interpreted two ways. One, the vision of AI that big tech is telling us that this new technology is going to save us is inherently untrue, right? And also that our communities have a rich knapsack of tools, right, and competencies and sensibilities that can help us actually dismantle this system. And so there's a couple frameworks that I think really help describe what's going on. The idea first of racial microaggressions. And as Chester Pierce says, one must not look for the gross and the obvious. The subtle, cumulative mini assault is the substance of today's racism. These put downs, seemingly innocent, could slowly crush the human spirit under a devastating burden, leading to a lack of self-esteem and confidence, and eventually to shorter lives, right? Thinking again about this idea of something very small but impactful. Dr. Ruha Benjamin gives another beautiful example of a microaggression when she says that racism gets under the skin and into the placenta, restricting blood flows so that Black American babies are disproportionately born premature due to the accumulation of stress and strain shouldered by expectant mothers. These microchips accumulate in the seemingly soft wear and tear that exposes Black lives to death even before birth. And so when we think about this idea of microaggressions in the technology space, I think about them as algorithmic microaggressions. These bugs and these glitches are not innocent, they're algorithmic microaggressions, right? Seemingly innocuous racial assaults or put downs that are automated and unconsciously encoded, and they're symptomatic of a technologically codified system of white supremacy. And so often when I say algorithmic microaggressions, folks are like, okay, but what is an algorithm? And so an algorithm defined computationally is a set of instructions designed to solve a problem, right? A set of logics or instructions designed to solve a problem. And I want to go back even further past, the 50s and 60s and 70s idea of microaggressions to think about algorithms and technology even before then, right? And so this quote by Saidiya Hartman, I think, beautifully articulates algorithms. She says, Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery. Skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. So you can see the idea of this political arithmetic, right? Racial calculus. You can see how racism has this computational component. Dr. Milner from Data for Black Lives builds on this idea by saying, in the US, racism has always been numerical. The decision to make every Black life count as 3/5 of a person was embedded into the Electoral College, an algorithm that continues to be the basis of our current democracy. Histories of redlining, segregation, voter disenfranchisement, and state-sanctioned violence have not disappeared, but they have been codified, right? And finally, W.E.B. Du Bois asks this salient and timeless question, right? How does it feel to be a problem? And he argues that the problem of the 20th and the 21st century is the problem of the color line, right? The Negro problem. And so from this transdisciplinary and historically conscious lens, two things become concrete for me. The first being anti-Black outputs are neither a bug nor a glitch, right? They are a foundational design feature, right? Not only of our technologies, but of our society and our schools. And in this lens, it also becomes clear that anti-Blackness is actually an algorithm, right? a set of instructions designed to solve the problem. But in this case, the problem has always been Black life. So again, I believe in Sankofa, right? This idea, it's a Ghanaian term that means go back and get it, right? And essentially what that means is we cannot understand contemporary social issues without doing a deep historical analysis, similar to what I just kind of laid out, right? White supremacy demands kind of an ahistoricism, right? That these are new problems that kind of emerged out of nowhere, when actually our ancestors and our elders have said that we must actually go back and get it. And so I want to reimagine some of the prominent terms related to technology, right? So Dr. Ruha Benjamin gives us this reimagining of hacking. And she says to hack a system, one needs an in-depth understanding of how it works, its strengths and its weaknesses, and a vision of how to make it better, to make it do something it wasn't meant to do. So when I look back at these pictures, it becomes increasingly clear that our communities have always hacked these systems for joy, hope, and healing. And in each one of these images, if you look closely, you can see how we have taken space, right, where space was not given, and created ruptures in the socio-technical fabric of white supremacy, right? Whether it's the shoes online sending subversive messages, whether it's creating a soccer field where oil rigs should be, or art on the train tracks that are supposed to keep us bound within, constrained within resource-deprived communities. Our communities have always been savvy in this way. So I think back to debugging, right? And I think about the history of the term. And so actually the idea of a bug in the system was a literal actual example of a bug being caught in a system. So there was a female computer scientist who was at work one day, and the computational system they had actually had shut down. No one could figure out what was going on and why the system wasn't working. And she actually was the person who opened opened up the system, like the little doors to where all the wires and everything is, and the hardware, and found that there was a very small moth that was caught in the system. And when she removed the moth, the system came back to life. And when I think about that differently, I ask myself, what does it mean actually for Black youth to become those bugs in the system, right? They're equipped with the critical literacies, the cultural sensibilities, and the computational skills to dismantle an entire system, right? That these small subversions are actually profound. And I don't want them to simply dismantle and destroy a system, right? But I also hope to make them able to re-envision these systems, right? To make the systems do something they weren't meant to do, which is to sustain Black life, living, and futurity. And so I think about Dr. Bettina Love's call to prepare students to do more than survive, right? And so rather than prepare them to just go into STEM in the same ways, right, and then be hired into these corporations that ask them to build weapons and advanced systems that do all of the horrific things that I've laid out in the beginning of this presentation, right? I actually want to tinker with STEM as well. And this is because my father, though he hacked his way into STEM, right, and he became a computer scientist, he experienced so much rampant and virulent racism that it was debilitating. And my dad actually had a mental health break when I was younger. And now I actually take care of him full time, right? He's no longer able to work, and he's really navigating a lot. And so I understand how STEM, right, not just our technologies, not just our schools, but also STEM as a discipline is one of like racialized death and dying, right, and dehumanization. And so we can't simply prepare our young people to just go into the system as it is, right? But we also need to reimagine STEM with them. And so I actually created the Race Abolition Artificial Intelligence Summer Program at UCLA. We completed our 4th year this summer. In this picture, this was from 2023. We had the absolute pleasure of having Dr. Ruha Benjamin visit us, which was life-changing for so many reasons. But this program really is about designing a STEM otherwise, right? And so young people are invited to take a more critical stance on technology and learn from abolitionist practices of how to reimagine STEM. And interestingly enough, the kids who opt into this program, they have two choices. They have a STEM course and they have a social science course. And my course is the social science one. So everyone who joins my course is like, oh my gosh, yay, I hate STEM. And so I picked this course because it's social science. And I'm like, surprise, it's also STEM, right? And so they're usually at first horrified, like, oh my God, I got duped. And then by the end, they actually say, wow, if STEM was like this, I could totally become a computer scientist. I could totally see myself being a platform designer. So I think it really is important to think about access, right? And diversity once we actually change STEM. And the last thing I want to say about this slide, the reason I focus on abolition as a framework, thinking about the slide right before this, is that abolition, the etymology of the word abolition is abolere and olere, right? And abolere means to destroy, but olere means to grow. And so calls for abolition have never simply been about destroying a system, right? And bringing white supremacy to its knees. It's also been about dreaming up a system that looks differently, right? That can foster life. And so we can't just only focus on critique. We have to also build hope. We have to also engage in this freedom dreaming and this speculative world building. So I want to rethink these calls for critical AI literacy, right? And think about the types of skills our young people need in order to do more than survive, right? We want them to thrive. We want them to build new worlds and new socio-technical and educational futures. And so these are kind of the three tenets that undergird my particular approach to critical AI literacy. It's the idea first of fostering students' socio-technical consciousness, helping them make sense of their everyday experiences with digital and algorithmically mediated racism, fostering socio-technical resistance, right? Helping them find ways to critically navigate, resist, refuse, and subvert algorithmic racism across different technologies. And finally, inviting them to engage in socio-technical freedom dreaming, to reimagine and dream up counter technologies that protect and sustain Black life, that advance joy, and that support wellness on a techno-structural and socio-technical level. And I'm going to show you in this last portion of my talk some of the lessons that we do in order to do that. We take an ecological and systems conscious approach to AI in education. So it's not just about the user and the tool, right? It's not about prompt engineering specifically. It's this broader context. So we look at historical knowledge. We think about algorithmic consciousness. We center students' experiential insights. We think about the socio-political context like labor and civil rights. And we consider environmental connections. We start by thinking about algorithms as racial logics, right? Sets of rules and common sense understandings. And we recognize that algorithms are actually analog as well, right? Some of the common examples are like recipes, right? So I like to actually talk about some of the racial algorithms or the racial logics that structure our lives and schooling experiences. So one of the first activities we do is we think about the algorithmic logics behind Trayvon Martin's killing, and we use the if-then math function to do so. So one of the ways that students make sense of what happened to Trayvon Martin is through this algorithm, right? And this is a common algorithm. If a Black boy is wearing a hoodie and in a white neighborhood, then he is a dangerous thug that should be shot, right? We also think about this example on the right. I took this picture from Walmart in Burbank, California, and it's the aisle marker that shows all of the items that are in an aisle, right? And in this aisle, there are bleach, tortillas, laundry detergent, and international foods. And this is a classroom full of Black and brown youth, right? So immediately they see the racism embedded, right? And the racial logics that say people of color, right, particularly our Latinx colleagues, are somehow inherently janitors and maids, right? And so they can just go and get their tortillas and their cleaning products, right, in one aisle. And this is more efficient or effective. And students also note that not only is this just problematic, like maybe it hurts your feelings, like that's like the socio-emotional harm, right? that we need to pay attention to, but they also note that this is racialized death, right? To have your foods placed next to toxic cleaning products is actually inherently dangerous. And I don't know about y'all, but I don't usually find food in the same aisle as the bleach, right? And so we talk about this as algorithms that produce and exacerbate racialized death and dying. We then move on to writing algorithms that constrict and constrain and structure our own educational experiences. So these are two algorithms that students wrote up themselves. The first student says, if a Black child gets too loud in class, they deserve to be punished. And another student says, if you do not present as your biological sex, then you are forced to conform by your teachers and your peers. So you can see here the connection between racial logics, right, beliefs, and their material consequences on educational equity. We then talk about everyday debugging that Black youth do on social media. So this was a case where a young Black boy uploaded a picture of himself and his Black friend, and she was tagged as a gorilla by Google's image recognition system. And he said, okay, that's odd. And so what he did was he tested it and he uploaded the picture multiple times. And every time the image recognition system identified her as a gorilla, right? And so this actually broke open this racial bias within Google's image recognition system. Like it brought it to an international scale. And so what Google did to fix it was they simply made it impossible to search for gorillas, right? This is the fix that they did to this day. We also do a Google image search, right? And we do different experiments with different terms. So things like 3 white teenagers, and we look at the results. We do 3 Black teenagers, and we look at the results. And we talk about why these results look differently. We also use teachable machines to recode these findings, right? And so teachable machines essentially kind of shows how image recognition system works. So you can create a data set of, let's say, cats, pictures of cats, and then do a data set of a bunch of pictures of dogs. You train the model, and then the image recognition system should be able to differentiate between images of cats and dogs that you show it, right? So what the students ended up doing is recoding those biased results that they got in Google results. And so one of the groups actually found that when they searched images of professional hair, it was all pictures of white folks. And when they searched pictures of unprofessional hair, it was pictures of Black people's natural hairs, right? Like braids and dreadlocks, natural styles. And so they actually put styles like natural hairstyles in for professional hair and retrained the model. We did a history of robots. And I won't spend too much time because I know I'm running out of time because we had a robot in class. But we learned that the very first robot was modeled after a Black man here in the US in the 1930s. And Rostis was his name. He had 3 names. It was Rostis the mechanical robot, Rostis the mechanical Negro, Rostis the mechanical slave. Okay. And that's not that surprising because the etymology of the word robot, robota, actually means slave, right? And so the reason we did this historical analysis is because the students noticed that these serve bots that were running around campus and running around LA, right? The serve bots, all of them had names that were people of color names. They were Jamarcus, right? They were Natasha, they were Jamar. And so trying to figure out why the robots were racialized brought us to this interesting history. We also looked at images of the internet infrastructure. So the image on the left is all of the subsea cables that support our internet. It's the internet hardwire. And then on the image on the right is the middle passage, right? How slaves were actually brought over to the West. And so we talk about the similarities between these 2 images. We talk about the labor that goes behind the scenes for ChatGPT. So this article that came out, right, that said that OpenAI actually pays Kenyan workers less than $2 an hour to make ChatGPT less toxic. And another article that revealed that prison labor is actually used to clean ChatGPT. So actually the intelligence behind these systems are racialized labor forces that are coerced and contained and oftentimes caged. Y'all are very familiar with the environmental harms. The students are often horrified to learn that a single conversation with ChatGPT is the same as drinking a bottle of water. because our data centers actually use water to keep their the servers cool. And unfortunately, these AI systems are increasing power outages. They are draining our rivers to the point of extinction, and they're creating a drought. And unsurprisingly, these data warehouses are disproportionately located in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. Finally, we look at abolitionist technologies, right? Tools that were made by and for our communities to advance justice. And so I'll just call out two examples. Abolition is a crowdfunding app that rounds up your spare change and donates it to folks of color who are incarcerated simply because they are unable to pay bail. And the image on the bottom right is called Ecosia. This is an internet browser that actually, when you use it as a search, like instead of Google, it actually works to plant trees. So this is the number of trees that were planted every time that somebody used this search engine, right? So thinking about ways of engaging in AI that are environmentally conscious, that are racially conscious, and that really protect our young people. So I know I'm technically 8 minutes over, but I'm just going to show y'all some of our youth projects because I think they really foster critical hope and they show what AI can be, right, when designed with our communities in mind. So our first project, the young people lay out a complex problem that they want their AI system to solve. They state, in schools, Black youth are forced to conform to white standards in order to survive and succeed. They also experience microaggressions from teachers and peers. Because of this pressure to conform, some Black youth may miss out on community cultural knowledge and an understanding of their true history. This is a significant issue because the school system is negatively affecting the mental and physical health of Black youth. Poverty causes a lack of access to healthcare, which makes it more difficult for Black kids to get resources. Now, I want to know, this is very interdisciplinary, right, and systems focused and historically conscious. This is a very different rendering of the problem that we're given from big tech, which basically says, oh, teachers are terrible, right, and really it's just ineffective, so we're just going to use AI. So you can see already how they are taking a better approach to defining the problem that they want to solve. So this group actually comes up with Jordan, who they say is the Black Moxie. And for those of you who are familiar with Moxie, on the robot slide, you can kind of see Moxie in the forefront of one picture. It was blue. Moxie was actually supposed to be a socio-emotional support robot that helps you with like meditation and breathing and just kind of being like more centered in your body, along with doing all kinds of other activities and like playful learning. So the students actually re-envisioned Moxie to be a source of racialized support. So they have here some of the features that it talks to kids about Black history, that it has micro affirmations. This was important because the students understood that microaggressions actually shorten life expectancy by depleting your telomeres, which are the caps on the ends of your chromosomes that scientists believe are like where life resides, right? And so actually on the flip side of that, studies show that micro affirmations are actually life sustaining, right? That they actually protect you from the devastating impacts of racism. And so the kids thought we will actually algorithmically codify this racial protection. The second group identified the disproportionate overrepresentation of Black women in infant and maternal mortality rates as a problem to be solved, right? So they talk about how Black mothers are 247% more likely to die in childbirth because of racism. And they trace the historical roots and why this actually happens. They have some statistics here. And their solution actually was to not use AI. They wanted a very rudimentary website, like social media space, essentially, for Black mothers and Black birthing people, where they could actually connect with other women of color and doctors of color and doulas of color to actually get more information and to have a network of support. They thought robustly about their content moderation systems, right? Thinking about making sure that their content moderation systems didn't actually weed out AAVE, right? Or content about racial justice, and that they actually didn't want AI moderation systems. They wanted to hire content moderators, human content moderators, right? Who were simply trained on the nuances of language and racial justice. So this group, I think, gives us an interesting vision that does not include these harmful systems. And then finally, one of the groups actually proposed a technology for the police that they called blinders. And this technology essentially would be worn by officers, and it would make individuals who were stopped, like at traffic stops, for instance, to seem race neutral, right? That it would simply blur everyone out, so you couldn't be stopped based on your race. They gave us this historical reasoning, this historical rationale, saying that the history of stop and frisks and the history of policing is rooted in slavery. And they also recognize the carceral connections between current technology, thinking about how prison labor is actually used in manufacturing. So they have these components to think about the system. Now, when they presented this to the students and their peers were like, no, because we actually don't believe that making AI technologies for the police is ethical. We actually believe that that system is inherently unethical, and they use their experiential knowledge to prove it, right? They talked about how police currently have a lot of technology and they simply take off their body cams, right? Or they do things like they play songs, like they will play Taylor Swift songs so that if that video that's recorded gets uploaded to YouTube, YouTube's content moderation systems will take the video down because you can't post Taylor Swift's music, right? And so they were like, we don't even want to give more money to the police. We actually think we should stay away from that. And so this group actually said, you know what? Y'all are right. We aren't going to do that. We're going to rethink a technology that's designed with our community, that focuses on community resources. And so I just want to end by saying you can see in all of these examples how those young people use these critical literacies that thought broadly about technology, right? They thought about the histories that bring us to this point of technology, right? Slavery, the experiments on Black women in gynecology, etc. They focused on their experiential insights. They understood the algorithms like content moderation systems and facial detection systems. They thought about the socio-political context, right? That Black mothers are dying because of racism, that students of color are having hard times in schools because of microaggressions. They thought about environmental consciousness. The first one actually talks about how that they don't want to use nuclear power and water, and they're going to think about how to use solar energy. So there's all these ways of rethinking about technology that I think are so important. And I think our young people really provide us a vision for the future. Thank you.
As you know, Dr. Tanksley, we have leaders in the room, and leaders want to solve problems. And you just dropped about 1,000 problems on us. They're, small ones and big ones, and so of course, people are talking about that. I want to go to the issue of regulation and policy, because in one of your examples, you talked about how policy is not sufficient. And I understand that, because there's also the implementers. We have to think about the policy, but then also who's implementing the policy. Leaders have the ability to revise and inform policies. And after you drop the 1,000 problems, I'm sure everybody in this room can come up with 1,000 policies that need to be revised and informed by your research. And so could you just share an example or two, if you know of them, about leaders who may have changed policies, and or where you think that we should turn our attention to first in the current context?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. So I think an important step is thinking about the adoption of these technologies, right? I think right now there's a lot of rhetoric around we have to jump on the AI train. Like it's leaving without us, and we're going to disenfranchise our youth, right? Our Black and brown youth. This is commonly said. We're going to hurt Black and brown kids if we don't start working on AI and incorporating AI. And that really echoes big tech's notion of move fast and break things, right? That's what they say innovation is, moving fast and breaking things. But time and again, the things that are broken, right, are our schools, our young people, our communities. So I think actually we need to pause and think about rebuilding and repairing things. So with that being said, how do we go about procuring these technologies? Often our school leaders are the ones who are approached by big tech or small tech, right? There's an increasing number of small tech companies that say, hey, we have this awesome tool that's going to use AI to advance equity, and it's going to provide, all of these supports. And I think being able to know what to audit, right? So what are your environmental concerns, or like what are your environmental outputs, right? Asking these companies what data set was this trained on. A lot of the companies are training on Reddit, right, or Twitter or Truth Social. And so when you have a data set that is inherently biased, right, you're going to get those results. Thinking about the types of carceral connections, asking them, is the police connected to this technology? Where is this data sold to? And so I think those are just some everyday practical questions that you can ask before signing on to these tools. And also, I think it's okay to not adopt tech without fully knowing, right, what are some of the implications. And then the other thing I'll say is, I think we need to raise not only our students and our educators' awareness, but I think parents need to be brought into this conversation. I think there's a lot of untapped power and potential in our communities and in our parents and our caregivers, because studies are showing that parents actually have no idea what's going on in schools and the types of technologies that are embedded into their young people's devices. So I think inviting parents into these conversations, and knowing that a lot of the tech budgets, right, in our schools, that we do have some money for technology, and that young people are actually saying that instead of, this is like in a lot of my publications, right, in my interviews with students, they're saying that instead of bringing more and more technology in, they want actual like training for their teachers, they want better pay for their teachers, they want culturally responsive curriculum. Like, the young people know what they want. And so I think another important move is inviting young people into these conversations about whether and how to adopt technology.
Thank you so much. That was at least, I don't know, 2 months worth of work, right? I'm just teasing. But thank you for that. I want to just end today's talk by giving you something to think about as you continue through your learning journey with us these 2 days. What happens if we take the idea of hacking and we bring it to leading for equity? Leaders for equity hack the system. Then ask yourself, what needs to be debugged? And how do we find those bots? I think that's really a big part of leadership, is doing that investigative work. And I want to thank you, Dr. Tanksley, for giving us the inspiration to think about those things. Thank you again for modeling leadership for the greater good during this difficult time. We wish you and your loved ones the very best during this time. We owe you a trip to Berkeley, so you're just going to have to come back again. And we look forward to hosting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. We hope that the discussion sparked new thinking and offered new perspectives into the ways educational leaders can critically engage with AI to better support historically marginalized students. Please keep the conversation going. We look forward to staying in touch across all of our communications channels, including our website and social media. As we close, we want to share a few additional resources to help you continue exploring today's themes. Feel free to visit our website to learn more about 21CSLA, read our latest research briefs, and subscribe to our monthly newsletter. We also recommend you listening to Equity Leadership Now, podcast episodes on future of AI in education. This episode features conversations with equity-focused educators and scholars, exploring how AI has evolved and what it means for schools and students. All of these resources are available on our website, and we hope they support your continued reflection and action. Take care, everybody.